The rain didn't just fall, it punished. It turned the neon lights of Manhattan into smeared, bleeding streaks of amber and crimson against the gray pavement. Mary Turner kept her chin tucked into the collar of her frayed coat, her breath hitching as a sharp cramp bloomed across her lower back. She was 34 weeks along, heavy and exhausted, carrying a secret that felt heavier than the child itself. Every step toward the subway was a calculation of survival. She was a ghost, a shadow, a name erased from the Cox Syndicate's ledgers, or so she had prayed for the last 12 months. She was so focused on the slick ground that she didn't see the black SUV glide to a halt near the curb. She didn't see the door open. She only felt the sudden, immovable wall of a human chest as she collided with it. The impact sent her bag flying, spilling cheap prenatal vitamins and half-bruised apples into the gutter. Mary gasped, her hands flying to the swell of her stomach to shield it from the jar. "I'm sorry, the rain," she stammered, her voice cracking. She began to crouch, the awkward weight of her belly making her knees buckle slightly. Her fingers brushed the freezing water of a puddle, reaching for her things, but then her heart stopped. Her breath turned to ice in her lungs. A pair of Italian leather Oxfords, polished to a mirror finish despite the deluge, stood inches from her hand. They were shoes that cost more than the life she had scraped together in the slums. Her gaze traveled upward with agonizing slowness, past the sharp crease of charcoal trousers and the broad, intimidating expanse of a cashmere overcoat. When she finally reached his face, the world went silent. Leon Cox stood over her like a dark god of vengeance. His black hair was swept back, damp from the spray, and his eyes, the same eyes she had once watched soften in the heat of a bedroom, were now 2 chips of frozen obsidian. A year of hunting her had carved his features into something jagged and predatory. He had come here to find a traitor. He had come to reclaim the woman who had played him for a fool and vanished with his intel. Leon's hand reached out, his fingers curling with possessive force around her upper arm to pull her upright. His jaw was tight, a muscle jumping in his cheek as he prepared to deliver the cold, lethal ultimatum he'd been rehearsing for months. "I told you I'd find you, Mary," he rasped, his voice a low, terrifying vibration. But as he hauled her up into the light of a street lamp, his words died. His grip didn't loosen, but his entire body went rigid. His gaze dropped from her terrified eyes to the gap in her soaked coat, landing on the unmistakable, heavy curve of her pregnancy. The rage that had sustained him for a year didn't vanish. It transformed. It became a jagged, suffocating shock. Leon's breath hitched, his eyes widening as he stared at the life she was carrying. He looked at her stomach, then back at her pale, rain-streaked face, doing the silent, frantic math of a man whose entire reality had just been rewritten. "Mary," he breathed, the name no longer a threat but a broken vow. "Whose is it?" The transition from Mary Turner to operative Nightingale had been forged in the sterile, windowless basements of a facility the public didn't know existed. Long before the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan and the weight of a child, there was the scent of ozone and the rhythmic thud of a heavy bag. Mary remembered the bruising intensity of her handlers, the way they had stripped away her civilian softness until she was nothing but a weapon wrapped in silk. "Trust is a luxury for the dead," her mentor had hissed, pinning her to the mat during a hand-to-hand drill. "You don't love the target, you study him. You become the mirror that reflects exactly what he's missing." The mission was simple on paper: infiltrate the Cox Syndicate. The reality was a dance on the edge of a razor. Leon Cox was a man who smelled blood before it was even spilled, a predator who had survived 3 separate assassination attempts before his 25th birthday. To get close to him, Mary couldn't just be a pretty face. She had to be a soul-deep deception. She spent months memorizing his bank ledgers, his preferred vintage of scotch, and the specific way his gaze lingered on the art in his penthouse. She remembered the night of the gala, the first time she had stepped into his orbit. She had worn a gown of midnight blue, the silk heavy and expensive against her skin, concealing a micro-transmitter sewn into the hem. Her heart had been a steady, practiced rhythm as she watched him from across the ballroom. Leon had stood at the center of a circle of sycophants, a king in a tailored suit, his presence commanding the very air in the room. When their eyes finally met, she didn't look away. She gave him the look they had coached her to give, a mixture of intrigue and a carefully manufactured vulnerability that hid the cold, calculating mind of a spy. The seduction had been surgical. She had played the part of the sophisticated outsider, a woman who understood the weight of power but wasn't intimidated by it. Every touch, every whispered confidence over crystal glasses of vintage wine had been a calculated move to lower his guard. She had watched for the cracks in his armor, the moment his predatory instincts softened into something resembling genuine interest. She had been searching for the keys to his digital vault, for the names of his overseas suppliers, and for the leverage the agency needed to dismantle his empire. She had been Nightingale, a ghost in the machine, recording his secrets while he slept beside her. She had been a professional, a liar of the highest caliber, convinced that her heart was as cold as the surveillance equipment hidden in her vanity. She never expected the mission to end with a positive pregnancy test and a soul-shattering realization. She had forgotten the first rule of the facility. She had looked into the mirror she created for him, and she had started to believe the reflection. The rain continued to lash against the windows of Leon's armored SUV, but the interior was a tomb of silent, suffocating tension. He didn't take her back to the penthouse. Not yet. He needed to see the world she had chosen over him. He needed to understand how the woman who had once dripped in Bulgari diamonds and slept on thousand-count silk was now standing before him in a coat that was little more than a collection of damp threads. When they reached the tenement building in Bed-Stuy, Leon felt a visceral wave of disgust. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and old damp, the wallpaper peeling away like dead skin. Mary walked ahead of him, her gait heavy and protective, her hand never leaving the underside of her belly. She didn't look back as she fumbled with a rusted lock, her fingers shaking so violently the keys clattered against the floor. Leon picked them up, his large, warm hand brushing hers for a fraction of a second, a contact that made her flinch as if he'd burned her. He pushed the door open and stepped into a space that was smaller than his walk-in closet. The poverty play, as his mind instinctively labeled it, was devastating in its detail. There was no furniture but a sagging twin mattress on the floor and a single wooden chair. A lone light bulb flickered overhead, casting harsh, unforgiving shadows. Leon didn't ask for permission. He moved with the predatory efficiency of a man used to taking what he wanted. He walked to the kitchenette, his expensive shoes sounding like gunshots on the warped linoleum. He pulled open the refrigerator. The motor groaned, a dying sound in the quiet room. Inside, there was a half-empty carton of generic milk, 3 withered carrots, and a jar of peanut butter. That was all. His jaw tightened until it ached. He turned to the small table where a single piece of paper sat weighted down by a glass of tap water. He picked it up. Final notice, 72 hours to vacate. The silence in the room stretched until it was paper-thin. Leon looked from the eviction notice to Mary, who stood by the window, her silhouette framed by the flickering neon of a bodega sign across the street. She looked fragile, a ghost of the operative who had once stood toe-to-toe with him in a boardroom. But as a spy, she was trained to endure. As a mother, she looked defeated. 8 months, Leon said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated in the small space. You lived like this for 8 months. You carried my son in a room that doesn't even have heat, eating scraps while I was tearing the city apart looking for you. It wasn't your business anymore, Mary whispered, her eyes fixed on the rain. Leon crossed the room in 2 strides, his presence suddenly absolute, blotting out the light. He grabbed the eviction notice and tore it into a dozen pieces, letting the white scraps fall like snow onto the dirty floor. Pack the bag, Mary. The play is over. You're coming home, and if you ever try to starve my heir again, the agency won't be the only thing you have to fear. The penthouse was exactly as she remembered it, a sprawling monument of glass, steel, and cold ambition perched high above the shimmering grid of Manhattan. Leon didn't ask her to enter. He directed her with a hand on the small of her back, a gesture that felt less like support and more like a brand. The air inside was climate-controlled to a perfect, sterile temperature, a jarring contrast to the damp chill of the Brooklyn tenement she had occupied only hours ago. Silk rugs muffled his footsteps, and the scent of expensive sandalwood and aged leather rose to greet them, a familiar sensory trap designed to make her forget the world outside existed. Your old room has been prepared, Leon said, his voice dropping to a low, possessive hum. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the floor-to-ceiling windows where the rain streaked the glass like tears. The fridge is stocked. A specialist will be here at dawn to check the baby. You don't leave this floor without a four-man detail. Is that clear? Mary didn't fight him. She played the part of the broken, exhausted mother, letting her shoulders slump and her gaze remain fixed on her swollen ankles. I'm tired, Leon. I just want to sleep. He watched her for a long moment, his eyes searching for the fire he used to see in her, finding only the hollowed-out shell of a woman defeated by poverty. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement, before turning toward his private office. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut, the sound echoing through the vaulted ceiling like a vault door sealing shut. As soon as the latch engaged, the exhaustion vanished from Mary's eyes, replaced by the razor-sharp focus of operative Nightingale. She didn't go to her room. Instead, she moved with ghost-like efficiency toward the kitchen, her fingers tracing the underside of the marble island. While Leon believed he was securing his heir in a fortress, he had actually invited the ultimate surveillance device back into his inner sanctum. She reached into the waistband of her maternity leggings, pulling out a device no larger than a grain of rice. A high-frequency burst transmitter she had kept hidden in the lining of her worn coat for months, waiting for this exact moment. Leon's office shared a ventilation duct with the guest wing. With the practiced ease of a woman who had spent years infiltrating high-security hubs, she slipped the bug into the recessed lighting fixture near the office wall. She stood back, her hand returning to her belly as she felt the baby shift. The agency wanted Leon's head, and Leon wanted her soul. In this gilded cage, the stakes had never been higher. As she heard Leon's muffled voice through the wall, discussing syndicate logistics, Mary leaned her head against the cool plaster. She was back in the lion's den, and this time she wasn't just recording his secrets. She was making sure she lived long enough to use them as her final escape. The silence of the penthouse was heavy, a thick velvet shroud that only the ultra-wealthy could afford. Mary sat by the expansive glass wall, watching the city lights flicker like dying embers below. She was wrapped in a cashmere robe that cost more than her Brooklyn tenement, yet she felt more exposed than ever. The transmitter in the vents was humming, feeding data back to a handler who likely didn't care if she lived or died, so long as the syndicate fell. The door to the living area groaned open, and the scent of Leon's expensive tobacco drifted in before he did. He had shed his jacket and tie, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, looking less like a king and more like a man haunted by his own shadows. He didn't speak. He simply crossed the room and sat on the ottoman across from her, his dark eyes fixed on the swell of her stomach. "He's quiet tonight," Leon remarked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that vibrated in the small space between them. "He's tired, Leon. We both are," Mary replied, her voice steady despite the way her pulse hammered against her ribs. She was Nightingale. She was an operative. Every word should have been a move on a chessboard, but the exhaustion was real, and the warmth of the room was beginning to melt the ice she had kept around her heart. Without asking, Leon reached out. His hand was massive, his skin tanned and rough compared to the delicate silk of her robe. He paused, his palm hovering just inches away, a rare moment of hesitation from a man who usually took what he wanted without apology. Mary looked at his hand, the same hand that had signed death warrants and held her with a tenderness that had nearly ruined her mission. She didn't pull away. As his palm made contact with the fabric over her belly, a sudden, sharp jolt radiated from within. The baby kicked, a strong, rhythmic thud that pushed against Leon's hand. Leon's entire body went rigid. His breath hitched, a jagged sound that broke the silence of the room. His eyes flew to hers, and for the first time in a year, the mask of the Cox Syndicate head cracked. There was no coldness there, no calculation, only a raw, terrifying wonder. "My God," he whispered, his fingers splaying out as if to catch the sensation again. He's real." In that moment, the target disappeared. Leon wasn't a syndicate boss or a source of intel. He was a father feeling his son for the first time. Mary felt a treacherous warmth bloom in her chest, a longing so fierce it threatened to choke her. The data she was stealing, the bugs she had planted, the betrayal she was currently enacting, it all felt suddenly, sickeningly hollow. She looked at the man who had built a cage for her, realizing that for the first time she didn't want to fly away. She wanted to stay in the warmth of his hand, even if the price was her soul. Nightingale was fatting, and Mary was starting to drown. The vibration of the burner phone tucked beneath her pillow felt like a localized earthquake, shattering the fragile peace of the midnight hour. Mary waited until Leon's breathing was a steady, rhythmic shadow in the adjoining room before she retreated to the marble sanctuary of the bathroom. The screen's blue light was harsh, illuminating the deep circles beneath her eyes and the stark reality of the digital tether she couldn't cut. The voice on the other end was a synthesized chill, devoid of humanity or mercy. It was her handler, the man known only as Bishop, and he wasn't interested in the health of the baby or the emotional toll of her reunion. "Nightingale," the voice crackled. "The data from the transmitter is insufficient. The Syndicate is moving their offshore accounts within the next 48 hours. We can't wait for a slow bleed anymore." Mary leaned her forehead against the cold mirror, her hand instinctively dropping to the heavy swell of her stomach. "I'm 8 months pregnant, Bishop. I've done my job. I'm back inside. I'm giving you everything Leon says in his sleep." "It's not enough," Bishop snapped. "The agency has reclassified the mission. Leon Cox is too volatile to be left alive. You have the proximity, you have his trust. We've placed a fast-acting neurotoxin in the ventilation shaft behind the master suite. It's disguised as a routine maintenance canister. One puncture, one breath, and he's gone. It'll look like a cardiac event." The air in the bathroom suddenly felt thin, as if the toxin had already been released. "I won't do it," Mary whispered, her voice trembling. "Not like this, not with the child in the house." "You don't understand your position, Nightingale," the handler countered, the threat sharpening like a blade. "You were compromised the moment you didn't report the pregnancy. If Leon Cox isn't dead by Friday, we will consider you a rogue asset. We don't retire rogues with a pension. We erase them and anything associated with them. Do you understand the stakes for that child?" The line went dead, leaving a hollow dial tone that echoed in the silence. Mary stared at her reflection, seeing the ghost of the girl who had entered the facility years ago and the woman who was now being asked to murder the father of her son. The agency didn't see a mother, they saw a failing weapon. She stepped back into the bedroom, the shadows of the penthouse closing in like the bars of a cell. Leon shifted in his sleep, his hand reaching out toward her empty side of the bed in a subconscious gesture of protection. She looked at him, the man she was supposed to kill to save their baby, and realized the cage wasn't the penthouse. The cage was the life she had chosen long before she ever met him. If she didn't kill the king, the agency would execute the ghost and the heir. Nightingale had 48 hours to decide which life was worth more, her mission or her soul. The vibration of the burner phone tucked beneath her pillow felt like a localized earthquake, shattering the fragile peace of the midnight hour. Mary waited until Leon's breathing was a steady, rhythmic shadow in the adjoining room before she retreated to the marble sanctuary of the bathroom. The screen's blue light was harsh, illuminating the deep circles beneath her eyes and the stark reality of the digital tether she couldn't cut. The voice on the other end was a synthesized chill, devoid of humanity or mercy. It was her handler, the man known only as Bishop, and he wasn't interested in the health of the baby or the emotional toll of her reunion. "Nightingale," the voice crackled. "The data from the transmitter is insufficient. The Syndicate is moving their offshore accounts within the next 48 hours. We can't wait for a slow bleed anymore." Mary leaned her forehead against the cold mirror, her hand instinctively dropping to the heavy swell of her stomach. "I'm 8 months pregnant, Bishop. I've done my job. I'm back inside. I'm giving you everything Leon says in his sleep." "It's not enough," Bishop snapped. "The agency has reclassified the mission. Leon Cox is too volatile to be left alive. You have the proximity, you have his trust. We've placed a fast-acting neurotoxin in the ventilation shaft behind the master suite. It's disguised as a routine maintenance canister. One puncture, one breath, and he's gone. It'll look like a cardiac event." The air in the bathroom suddenly felt thin, as if the toxin had already been released. "I won't do it," Mary whispered, her voice trembling. "Not like this, not with the child in the house." "You don't understand your position, Nightingale," the handler countered, the threat sharpening like a blade. "You were compromised the moment you didn't report the pregnancy. If Leon Cox isn't dead by Friday, we will consider you a rogue asset. We don't retire rogues with a pension. We erase them and anything associated with them. Do you understand the stakes for that child?" The line went dead, leaving a hollow dial tone that echoed in the silence. Mary stared at her reflection, seeing the ghost of the girl who had entered the facility years ago and the woman who was now being asked to murder the father of her son. The agency didn't see a mother, they saw a failing weapon. She stepped back into the bedroom, the shadows of the penthouse closing in like the bars of a cell. Leon shifted in his sleep, his hand reaching out toward her empty side of the bed in a subconscious gesture of protection. She looked at him, the man she was supposed to kill to save their baby, and realized the cage wasn't the penthouse. The cage was the life she had chosen long before she ever met him. If she didn't kill the king, the agency would execute the ghost and the heir. Nightingale, the atmosphere in the penthouse, shifted with the suddenness of a pressure drop before a storm. Leon wasn't in the master suite when Mary emerged from the bathroom. The silence was too heavy, too deliberate. She found him in the living area, bathed in the blue-gold glow of the city's skyline, but he wasn't looking at the view. He was standing by the mahogany sideboard, a glass of amber liquid in one hand and a small, metallic object in the other. The microtransmitter. It looked pathetic and small sitting on the palm of his hand, a tiny grain of silicon that had just signed her death warrant. Beside him stood Marcus, his head of security, a man whose face was a mask of cold professionalism. Marcus held a handheld signal sweeper that was still emitting a low, rhythmic pulse. "I was going to give you the world, Mary," Leon said. His voice was terrifyingly calm, a low-frequency rumble that felt like a blade against her throat. He didn't look up. He just stared at the bug. "I was going to burn the city down to make sure you and the boy never felt the cold again. I thought you were just a woman who got scared and ran. I thought the poverty was your punishment for leaving me." Mary froze, her hand instinctively shielding her stomach. The spy in her searched for an exit, a weapon, a lie, but the mother in her was paralyzed by the look of absolute betrayal on Leon's face. The poor ex-girlfriend mask she had worn so carefully was stripped away, leaving her exposed as the predator she had always been. "Leon, listen to me." "Who are you?" He finally looked at her, and the obsidian depth of his eyes was shattered by a raw, bleeding hurt. He stepped toward her, the predatory grace of the syndicate boss replacing the tenderness of the father. "Because the Mary I loved didn't know how to bypass a multi-million-dollar encryption array. The Mary I knew didn't hide high-frequency burst transmitters in my private office." He threw the device onto the marble floor, the sound of it shattering like a gunshot. "Marcus found it during a routine sweep. It's military-grade, agency tech. You didn't just leave me, did you? You were never mine to begin with. You were a mission, a long-term play." "It started that way," Mary whispered, her voice trembling as the truth finally spilled out into the open air. "But the baby changed everything. I was trying to protect him from both of you." "Protect him?" Leon laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. He closed the distance between them, his hand gripping her chin, forcing her to look into the furnace of his rage. "You brought a wire into the home of my son. You turned his sanctuary into a kill zone for your handlers. You aren't a victim, Mary. You're a threat." He signaled to Marcus, his face hardening into the mask of the man who ruled the city with an iron fist. "Lock her in the reinforced suite. No phones, no windows. Check every inch of her skin for more devices. If a single signal leaves this building, she becomes a liability, and we both know how the syndicate handles liabilities." Leon turned his back on her, the silence of the room returning, colder and more final than any grave. Nightingale had been caught, and for the first time, she had no wings to fly. Had 48 hours to decide which life was worth more, her mission or her soul. The reinforced suite felt like a tomb of glass and cold marble. Leon stood by the sideboard, the neck of a crystal decanter clinking against a glass as he poured a deep, blood-red Cabernet. He didn't offer her any. The air was thick with the scent of fermented grapes and the metallic tang of unspoken violence. He turned, his silhouette a dark blot against the glittering city lights, and his voice was a whip crack in the silence. "Every word, Mary." From the night we met at the gala to the moment you planted that bug. I want the truth, or I swear on the life you're carrying, you'll never see the sun again." Mary sat on the edge of the bed, her hands knotted over the apex of her stomach. The spy in her was screaming to fabricate a backup story, but the woman was exhausted. "I was Nightingale," she whispered, the confession tasting like ash. "My objective was the Syndicate's offshore ledgers, but Leon, the pregnancy wasn't part of the plan. I ran because the agency wanted me to abort the mission and the child. I chose him over them. I chose him over you." Leon stepped closer, his shadow looming over her, his eyes burning with a mixture of hatred and a desperate, agonizing love. He opened his mouth to shatter her defense, but the words were drowned out by the sudden, percussive roar of an explosion. The floor buckled. The floor-to-ceiling windows, built to withstand small arms fire, spiderwebbed under a barrage of high-caliber rounds. "Ambush," Marcus's voice crackled over the intercom. "The Russo family has the perimeter. They're breaching the helipad." Leon reacted with the fluid lethality of a man born to war. He dropped the wine glass, the Cabernet spreading across the white rug like a fresh wound, and drew the weapon concealed at his small of his back. But as he reached for Mary to drag her to the panic room, she let out a sound that stopped his heart. It wasn't a scream of terror. It was a low, guttural moan of sheer physical agony. She collapsed to her knees, her face drained of all color, her hands clawing at the silk sheets. A hot, terrifying rush of fluid soaked through her dress, blooming dark against the fabric. "Leon!" she gasped, her eyes wide and unfocused. "The baby!" "It's too soon. Something is wrong." The Syndicate boss stood frozen for a heartbeat, a man caught between a war and a miracle. Outside the door, the staccato rhythm of submachine guns grew closer, the scent of gunpowder drifting through the vents. His enemies were at the gates. His ex-wife was a spy who had betrayed his empire, and his son was coming into a world of fire and blood weeks before his time. Leon stepped over the spilled wine, shielding her body with his own as the first door in the hallway was kicked off its hinges. "Hold on, Mary," he growled, his voice a fierce promise against the chaos. "I'm getting you both out of here." The scent of cordite and copper filled the air as the master suite's reinforced doors buckled under a hail of lead. Leon stood before Mary, a shield of charcoal wool and raw defiance, his weapon barking back at the shadows in the hallway. He was a king fighting for a crumbling throne, but Mary could see what he couldn't, the red laser dot dancing across his sternum, a sniper's signature from the adjacent rooftop. Agony ripped through her midsection, a contraction so fierce it stole her breath, but the operative's instinct, the one buried under months of poverty and pretense, snapped into a cold, lethal clarity. Mary didn't scream. She didn't cower. With a guttural grunt of effort, she lunged from the bed, her fingers finding the heavy bronze statuette on the nightstand. In one fluid, practiced motion that defied her heavy frame, she hurled the weight through the remaining sliver of the window, shattering the glass and spoiling the sniper's line of sight just as the shot cracked through the room. The bullet grazed Leon's shoulder instead of piercing his heart. He staggered, the suddenness of her movement catching him off guard. "Mary, stay down!" he roared, but she was already moving. She rolled behind the marble kitchen island, her breathing ragged, her hand pressing against the damp silk of her dress. As two Russo hitmen breached the doorway, Leon's gun clicked empty. The hitmen leveled their submachine guns, a predatory grin spreading across the lead shooter's face. They saw a pregnant woman. They didn't see operative Nightingale. Mary reached under the lip of the island, tearing away the emergency tactical kit she had taped there during her first night back in the cage. She didn't look at the contractions. She looked at the targets. She tossed a flashbang canister into the center of the room. The world turned into a blinding white roar. Before the hitman could blink, Mary had surged upward, her movements a blur of elite close-quarters combat. She didn't use a gun. She used their own momentum against them, a series of precise, brutal strikes to the throat and temple that left both men crumpled on the floor before Leon could even draw his backup piece. Leon stared at her, blood dripping from his grazed shoulder, his chest heaving. He saw the way she held herself, the balance, the coldness in her eyes, the professional way she checked the dead men for extra magazines. The poor pregnant ex was gone. In her place stood a woman who could dismantle an army. "You weren't just a spy," Leon breathed, his voice a mix of awe and terror as he watched her sink back to her knees, the next wave of labor pains twisting her features into a mask of grit. "I was the best they had," she gasped, her fingers digging into the marble. "And I used every bit of it to keep you alive. Now get me to the panic room, our son. He's coming." Leon didn't hesitate. He scooped her into his arms, finally understanding that the woman he had tried to cage was the only one capable of saving his legacy. The war was still raging outside, but inside the hallway, the syndicate boss and the Nightingale were finally on the same side. The iron-scented air of the penthouse had finally cleared, replaced by the sterile, quiet hum of a private medical suite hidden deep within the syndicate's subterranean bunker. Outside, the city was still reeling from the night of fire and glass, but inside these reinforced walls, the world had shrunk to the size of a bassinet. Mary lay against the pillows, her face pale but her eyes burning with a new, lethal clarity. Beside her, Leon Cox sat with his sleeves rolled up, the bandage on his shoulder a stark white against his tanned skin. In his arms, he held a miracle wrapped in cashmere, a son with Leon's dark, restless eyes and Mary's quiet, observant stillness. "The agency sent an extraction team to the ruins of the penthouse," Leon said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that didn't wake the sleeping infant. "They found the Russo hitmen, but they didn't find a trace of operative Nightingale. As far as the world is concerned, you died in the crossfire." Mary reached out, her fingers brushing the soft cheek of her son. The mission was over. The poverty play was a memory, but the cage was gone, too. She looked at Leon not as a target and not as a captor, but as a partner forged in a crucible of betrayal and blood. "They'll come looking eventually, Leon. Bishop doesn't leave loose ends." "Let them come," Leon replied, a slow, predatory smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He looked down at the boy, then back at Mary. "They think they know the Cox Syndicate. They think they know how to handle a rogue spy. They have no idea what happens when the two are combined. I'm moving the operations to the Mediterranean. Neutral ground, backed by my capital and your intel. We aren't just surviving anymore, Mary. We're building something they can't touch." Mary felt the weight of the decision settle into her bones. She was no longer a weapon for a faceless government, and she was no longer a bird in a gilded cage. She was the architect of a new dynasty. She leaned her head against Leon's shoulder, watching their son breathe. The law could no longer reach them, and the shadows could no longer claim them. Together, they were the ultimate variable, a mafia king and a ghost operative, united by a love that had been meant to destroy them, but had instead made them invincible. "His name is Leo," Mary whispered, her voice a firm, unshakable promise. "And he will never know what it feels like to be afraid." Leon leaned down, kissing her forehead before looking toward the monitors that displayed their new perimeter. The cameras showed a horizon of endless sea and ironclad security. The old world was burning, but in the silence of the bunker, a new, deadlier empire had just been born. The dynasty was no longer a dream. It was a reality, written in the blood of their enemies and the silent, unbreakable vow of the spy who finally came home.